We'll give you a few more minutes to vote. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, and then we'll look at this poll results real quickly. Our speaker today is Misty Ritter. Misty works with the University of Missouri Extension. She is a county engagement specialist in Jefferson County. Now, a few things you may not know about Misty. She's had an interesting professional background. She's been with Extension, I guess, for almost 2 years, but she also has experience as a past president for an elementary PTO. You think she ever had to solve a problem in that type of a position? She's also worked at the St. Louis Science Center. I'm sure she's had to come up with some problem-solving solutions there. For education, she actually has a doctorate in education from...
In progress, David, in progress.
In progress. All right, thank you. At the University of Missouri St. Louis. She has a master's degree in nonprofit management from Washington University in St. Louis, a bachelor of biology with a minor in chemistry from Truman State University, and looks like maybe a bachelor of science in biology. Oh, she was also at the University of Missouri St. Louis working on that same degree as well. So an extensive background from chemistry to nonprofit management to education. So I am anxious to hear what Misty has to share with us today about problem solving. Let's take a look at this poll real quickly, and we'll hand it off to Misty. I'll go ahead and include some of these quotes in our text that goes out, our email that goes out later today, but looks like the quote from Albert Einstein may have been the most familiar. And anyway, thank you for joining in on that project. And Misty, it is all yours today.
Well, thank you, David. Thanks for having me. Somebody asked what my degree that I'm working on, and I'm working on a doctorate in education in heritage leadership, social justice, and sustainability. And so I work with a fabulous group of professionals. It's a cohort program. It's driven by the Carnegie Institute, and it's looking at how leaders who are working on applied education actually thrive in a cohort environment. And that's working together as a team to work through the dissertation process. So it's kind of a new program. It's being scrutinized, and that information on how successful this type of program will be shared throughout the university systems as it continues to evolve. But I'm really happy to be here today. I'm happy to work on this issue of problem solving. I think it's really appropriate that Maxwell framed problem solving right after the chapter on positive attitude, because I think that they kind of go hand in hand. I think that your attitude really does impact your reflection on problem solving. And so, David, if you would like to go ahead and throw up the PowerPoint. So we'll just start moving forward with it. So, and again, I think that the positive attitude aspect of leadership really does impact Maxwell's how he titled the chapter. He titled that chapter, go ahead, David, move us forward, that you can't let your problems be a problem. And I think that is tied hand in hand with attitude. And so Maxwell talks a lot. This was a really wordy chapter. There was a lot of stuff that he threw at us, but in the end, he really carried through the theme about rising to a challenge with that end goal in mind. Right now, we hear a lot of phrasing about that term pivoting, and I wanted to bring that up. Maxwell doesn't, because it's kind of a newer concept. But it's been around a long time. That it's that initial plan of, if that first plan doesn't work, then move on to plan B and to modify. And so I think that pivoting goes hand in hand with problem solving. You might hear me comment on that once in a while. So I just wanted to introduce that at the beginning. But let's go ahead and move forward, David, because Maxwell really introduces this chapter with kind of a unique group that here in Missouri we're pretty familiar with, and that's the Walmart group. You know, he worked really hard for many, many years problem solving along the way. Maxwell does a nice job of highlighting that. You know, he started off in a situation where his first problem had to do with competition. How did he differentiate himself from the competition? He made some changes in his business model. He had to move forward and work through the problems and the limitations of his Ben Franklin franchise agreement. He then goes on to manage some of the problems that he has to do with restocking and refinement with his distribution centers. And then all along, you know, though, he had that goal in mind of being profit-centered with high customer satisfaction. The picture that I have thrown up here, I actually found in the Walmart Digital Museum website. And it really talks about some of the innovations that he had to, problems he had to address, and innovations and solutions along the way he had to come up with, including computerization. And that's one of the things Maxwell talks about. It reminds me a little bit of one of the quotes back in Discernment chapter, where the IBM president at one point in time was on the records back in the 40s saying that he only thought there'd be room in the world for 5 computers, and here's Walmart needing to have computerization in all of his different stores and his distribution centers. And so this is one of those situations where you kind of look back in hindsight and you think about the problems that we have today we might not have had 30 years ago, and vice versa. The problems we had 30 years ago are perhaps long solved and moved in different directions, and we think about those very differently today. So go ahead, David. There will always be challenges, and you'll notice that I've actually changed Maxwell's introduction to this from problems to challenges, because I think that when I look at something and I use the word problem, my brain thinks about it a little differently, and I react to it in my gut a little differently than when I insert the word challenge. And so a lot of times, one of the first things I do when I do some problem solving is I try to reframe it in my brain that this is not necessarily a problem, this is a challenge. And then suddenly my attitude about wanting to address it and how I'm going to address it really does change quite a bit. But, you know, Maxwell comments that, you know, the world is always going to be complex and diverse. We are always going to have to interact with people, and people unto themselves create and change and create challenges. They say communication is one of our strongest elements about interacting with people, and that unto itself creates challenges and problems for us. And then, you know, we have to accept that there are situations that we just cannot control, that we have to face. And so with that, perhaps we need to keep moving forward, as Walt Disney, who is my favorite quote for problem solving, keep moving forward. Is David, you did not have that one up there as far as problems in quotes and things. So let's take a few minutes, and I'm going to ask you to put in the chat to think about some of those problems that you might have had 30 years ago today. It seems like a long time ago, and if you're a younger individual, 30 years ago might put you into a childhood, but I picked 30 years because that's a generation. So that creates a generational marker for us to think about. So be thinking about what are some of those problems that you had 30 years ago today. And imagine all the different thoughts and actions, the pivot that might have occurred that you or other people or organizations or groups might have needed to address them. But first, I do want to make a respectful note that one of the big problems that we're focused today has to do with our COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And so I do know that that is probably a big problem that a lot of people have in the front of their mind. But I want to think about a little history that goes into that and what those outcomes were. So on the slide, you'll see, you know, we've heard a lot about the 1918 influenza pandemic, commonly referred to as the Spanish flu. And we've been hearing a lot about some of the ways leaders address those concerns, address those problems. But I was reminded this Sunday when I was watching a morning news program about another health crisis that we had, and that was the polio epidemic. And it really resonated some of the different concerns and the different things that leaders were doing to address that, and the problem solving that went into funding and creating a vaccine. And it was through the polio epidemic that an organization a lot of us are familiar with, the March of Dimes, was founded. And all of that was to fund the research and development that ultimately led to a vaccine. So here's an organization that by the late 60s came along. They had effectively solved the problem for polio. And so this organization needed to seek out the problem of having to continue to find value and service in the world. And so they had the opportunity to shift their mission priorities to childhood health problems in general. And so here is a situation where 30 years ago we had a problem, or more than 30 years ago, and yet how it evolved, and yet we still have this complex world and outcomes that we can't always control. And so here we are faced again with another problem that our leaders and whether it's a leadership in our own household or nationwide, are working to address. Go ahead, David, let's move forward.
We're having a few comments in the chat about 30 years ago.
That's awesome. So let's look at those. Let's take a second and look at the chat and see what we want to highlight, David.
Let's see. Well, a couple that I can share with you. I don't know if you can see them as well. I went ahead and answered to myself 30 years ago. I was trying to find a way to make a small newspaper profitable enough that someone would actually buy it so I could do something else. That was, and that dealt with, personnel and ad sales, lots of things. Minimal computer usage at that time. Grant Townsend shares that in 1990, the business world was transforming from hard copy to computers. Nobody knew how to work at a computer. Much has changed since then. That is true. Think of how much we depend on them now, right? Cindy Wells says, I was returning to college to receive my first degree and supporting 3 children on a single income from my spouse 30 years ago. Meredith Berry, 30 years ago, was a working mother worried that I was ruining my children, not being home with them. Bill Lindsay shares that he was transitioning from slide rule to simple calculators to microcomputers 30 years ago. And Patricia Barrett was just starting with USDA in Northern Iowa 30 years ago. There's been a lot of change in 30 years.
But David, all of these problems that either you have faced or others have faced, they all work through the same concerns, and how we address them. Maxwell frames that we all have to go through the process of anticipating. Go ahead, David. Anticipating the problems.
Go ahead on the slide, you mean?
Sure. There we go.
Sorry.
In some of these problems, we anticipate. Part of the problem, we have to spend some time thinking about what the truth is. I think the truth section that Maxwell talks about is one that resonated with me the most. Talking about related to problems. When it comes to a problem or a challenge, how do we react to them? Do we accept them? Do we accept them and just put up with them? Do we accept them and try to make things better? And so those are some of the criteria that leaders have to consider. And perhaps it's that accept them and try to make things better that helps differentiate us being leaders versus us taking a step back and letting others need to lead. How do we handle them over time? And then we don't give up a major goal when we're down. So those are some of the considerations that Maxwell spends time thinking about. And you know, this is a pretty long chapter. There's a lot of thoughts that go into this. And David, why don't you move forward with the slide? But this is one of the things that I really like. This is a quote from John Foster Dulles, and you might be familiar with him in the sense of he was tapped as the namesake for Dulles Airport in the DC area. The measure of success is not whether you have a tough problem to deal with, but whether it is the same problem you had last year. And so I did a little wordplay in this quote, and you'll notice the second word of whether has been spelled slightly different. Maybe that might give you a little foresight into what story I'm about ready to share with you. That was a big example of a problem-solving situation that I stepped up to be a leader in. The little picture you see is a greenhouse. It was built on the grounds of my daughter's school. We had a very enthusiastic teacher apply for a simple grant, got enough funding to go down the road to a local hardware store and purchase a basic greenhouse kit. And over the summer, the principal herself, along with some staff, spent a few days screwing together all the pieces and placing the greenhouse on the grounds of the school. And as a member of the PTO and one of the parent leaders for the school science club, we were enthusiastic with the idea that we would have the opportunity to support outdoor learning at the school with a greenhouse. And then 2 days later, I got a text. I happened to be up in Hannibal, Missouri on the way back from a trip to Iowa, and there had been a storm that had come through. And straight line winds had basically taken this greenhouse up like a box kite and more or less turned it inside out. And so thus the problems ensued. Not only were the problems involved with fulfilling the grant, which we had received for the construction of a working greenhouse with some great educational outcomes that our school was trying to fulfill and working with the students, not to mention the fact that just the lost opportunity to start this new outdoor classroom space. So, David, let's move through to the next slides because this is where the problem solving really kicked in. So Dulles's quote has to do with the idea of whether or not you have the same problem that you had the next year. And that's what we were facing. We had the opportunity to get a new greenhouse. The hardware store was very generous with their return policy, believe it or not. And so a kit was repurchased, but then we had to face the fact that if we put the greenhouse up the same way it was before, we were basically facing the same problems again. And so how we faced the problems was putting together what we'll talk about here at the end, Maxwell's method. We assessed the problem, and of course our problem had to do with our construction, the fact that our greenhouse was up on the hill, and we would always have high winds blowing through that area. So we didn't do this alone. We looked at putting together a team, and we included resources such as the high school industrial arts class, which gave us some opportunity to think about the structure that we had. We brought in some individuals that had some building experience, and they helped us put together a plan to create not only a good foundation, but an internal frame that this entire greenhouse would be built upon and tethered to. We spent some time talking to more teachers throughout the building about what sort of use they saw themselves having with this greenhouse. So you'll notice the greenhouse is now tilted in another direction. It's actually tied so that the entryway is accessible to the sidewalk, which would make it more accessible to students who had special needs, mobility needs. The foundation allows us to raise it up. We had shifted the direction of it so that the sun would be coming in a different angle as recommended by the high school biology AP teacher. And in the end, we created a greenhouse that was accessible, it was strong, and it would be more effective in growing things for this building that actually had over 570-ish students. And so These were all problem-solving considerations, not to mention the additional funding, which helped, these additional plans forced our funding to be a lot higher than what the initial grant provided. And so some of the problem solving we had to go through had to do with where did we identify the funding. And we reached out to the local science club kids who did some fundraising for the floor. We reached out to our school's district's foundation, which provided some extra funding. We reached out to some community support and some other hardware stores, which helped us meet some of our material needs. So these were all the steps that we had to face in the problem solving about how to create a functional greenhouse. So when it was what all comes down to, though, the problem and challenges continue, because even though we now have a functional greenhouse, which happens to be the only working greenhouse on a school campus in our county, and we're very proud of that, we still are faced with those sticky problems, those problems that have to do with people. And that has to do with working with the educators and how to work the use of the greenhouse into their lesson plans. And so, again, life is complex, the world is complex, there are things that are out of control, but we continue to look at these problems as challenges and kind of keep moving forward with the whole process. So, David, if you don't mind moving forward with the slide, there are lots of different methods related to problem solving. You can go online, you can pull off old books from your shelf, and there's a lot of different processes. Maxwell proposes the methodology of TEACH. Discover what the real issue is. Exposure has to do with finding out what others have done. Assistance has to do with bringing in your team. You don't have to do this alone. Sometimes you can bring together a team. You can reach out to others and find out what they've done. You can be creative and apply brainstorming and come up with multiple solutions. Sometimes working with other people helps broaden your perspective on this and helps that brainstorming process as well. And then Maxwell says, hit it. And that is implementing the best solution. And as I said at the very beginning of the presentation, sometimes you have to pivot. Sometimes you have to go for plan B and go in a slightly different direction. But these steps all move towards lending in problem solving and addressing challenges. Again, keeping in mind that the world is complex and that most of the problems involve people. And when you have people, these can be sticky problems. And there are often things that we can't control. And sometimes you have to just use good old-fashioned discernment, like we talked about in week 7. And that is addressing the fact that sometimes we have problems that really can't be solved, or maybe we just can't address at the time. And so using a little discernment on what problems we do address. So let's throw up a quick survey, David, because I want people to think about what are some of those problems, what are some of those areas in our life that we have problems or challenges that maybe up until now we just really haven't been ready to address. Are these problems that maybe have to do with family? Or maybe you are a pro at dealing with family problems, and it's time to think outside of ourselves and our families and think about our communities. Maybe it's our church, a club, or organization. Maybe it's something out in nature, in the environment. Or maybe it's time to pull back in because you're a pro at helping other people solve problems, but it's time to be a leader in your own household or a leader of your own self. So let's just take a second and think about what are some of those problems that maybe we've not necessarily had our head in the sand. Maybe we acknowledge that there's a problem. Maybe it's a problem that we acknowledge, but we just haven't been willing to do anything about. Maybe it's now an area that we acknowledge that there's a problem and it's time to move forward with it. So everybody go ahead and submit. And if you'd like to share in the chat about what some of those challenging areas of problem solving that you think you are now fortified and ready to address, or that you're going to spend a little bit more problem solving skill working and getting ready to address. Let's go ahead and put those in the chat. And while you're thinking about that, I will share with you the final picture of the external outdoor classroom area, because one of the problems we found with our greenhouse is it was a great greenhouse and every student in the building contributed towards planting the pictured organic speckled lettuce. Every kid got to go in and plant a plant and be a part of the experience. But we found out that teachers needed a place to sit, because you can't have 30 kids in the greenhouse all at once. And so that led to another project which has to do with recycled bottle caps, and now the creation of 6 picnic tables, as well as an external garden. So again, always trying to keep moving forward.
What a
So
project. That's great.
Anything in the chat, David?
One said they're friends and club sisters. That's where they're going to be looking for trouble. There's only been one person marked other in the poll here. So it looks like, majority, here's why I'll go looking for trouble in family. But it's really, it's pretty evenly spread across all those categories. Even the other was the area of friends, family. Another comment in chat about relationships. So a lot of different categories where we have problems in life that need some focus and some time and work to help solve. Misty, what do you think from the reading and other research you've done on this? Are there some common things that kind of paralyze people or keep people from pursuing a solution to their problems?
David, a lot of the reading that I've done shows that sometimes people just get overwhelmed with the number of solutions that could be a possibility. And so, or they're overwhelmed with the number of problems that they have stacked up. They just don't know which one to address first. And so Maxwell really does spend a few minutes talking about how, you really can only address one problem at a time. And that ties into that concept of multitasking really isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Not everybody can really do that well. And so maybe just focusing on that one problem at a time will help you create some success and some focus to then help you move forward and make room in your life to help address that next problem.
That's a really, really good point. I'm glad you're the one that has been researching this and digging into it even deeper, because that was that's really important item to keep in mind for the whole discussion.
Well, thanks for having me, David.
You've done a great job. We of course are on for Friday, our next topic, and I don't have my cheat sheet with me, but it's in the reminder email that goes out and will go out later today. We'll have a different guest speaker on Friday. And please come back and join us. We want to keep you engaged. I think these live presentations are the best way to do that, and it's your opportunity to kind of give some feedback as well. So that's the end of our session today. Thanks for joining us. And if you want to stay on and ask questions or have further conversation, you can. But otherwise, we'll plan on seeing you on Friday. Thank you, everyone.